Today is Thursday, December 3, and the 5th day of Advent. My name is Pastor Anthony, and this is Wilderness Wanderings. Today our text comes from Exodus 3. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. Exodus 3, verses 7 through the first part of verse 8. When Elijah traveled to Mount Horeb, he discovered that the Lord was not in the fire. Years earlier, when Moses traveled to Mount Horeb, though, well, that's exactly where God was. It was on Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, where Moses encountered the burning bush, ever aflame, but never consumed. And it's out of that bush, which stood in the wilderness, on a deserted desert mountain, that Moses first met the God of his ancestors. Now, God had been active in Moses' life long before this, of course, but Moses probably hadn't either known it or paid much attention to God up till this point. He certainly hadn't had an experience of standing in God's presence quite like this, but now in the wilderness, Moses had his sandals off and his face hidden because God had shown up. But God hadn't only shown up for Moses' sake. God had come because of the misery and the suffering of his people. They had cried out to him, and God was concerned for them. So he set out to rescue them from their slavery. This story has an important echo in the scripture passage from Romans that we'll be exploring on Sunday. When Paul writes that we cry, Abba, Father, it's a favorite text of many of us. Well, as Paul writes that, he's echoing the same language of the cries of God's enslaved people in Egypt. They cried out to God, much in the same way Paul talks about. And as Moses discovered in the desert, those are the cries that God listens to. Cries that God responds to when, like a good father, he comes down and scoops us up in his arms to comfort us in the midst of our suffering. We are incredibly tired of this pandemic that we're slogging through. I know we're itching for any way to claw back some normalcy. We'd really rather focus on anything else. But we cannot let that stop us from taking account of our suffering and the suffering of our neighbors. As this thing drags on, jobs are being lost. Anxieties are rising. The days are growing darker as we head into December, and our collective capacity to deal with it all is growing thin. It's at just such times that God's people have cried out to him for mercy for themselves and for their neighbors in the past. And maybe that's not such a bad idea now either. Because it may be in wilderness places just like these where God suddenly shows up in a burning bush to say, I've seen the misery of my people. I've heard their cries, and so I have come. Now maybe God won't show up with fire. Maybe he'll come in the still small voice. But whatever the case, on my ornament today, I'm going to write, I've seen, I've heard, I've come. Those three phrases, I've seen, I've heard, I've come, to remind me that Jesus is always present in the midst of my suffering, shouldering the cross with me, even when I'm not aware of it. And to go with that phrase, I don't know, maybe I'll draw a cross or a burning bush in the desert, or maybe just a good father. I haven't decided yet, but I wonder what you'll draw. I'd also like to invite you to be with others today as God is with us. I wonder if there's someone you know who may be facing some particular suffering during this pandemic time. The invitation today is to cry out to God for that person in prayer, and then go and offer one tangible form of support to them as the hands and feet of Jesus. Maybe that's a card, maybe it's a call, maybe it's a gift card, a meal, etc. You decide. But as you journey on, remember that God is with you. May the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever He may send you today. May He guide you through the wilderness, protect you through the storm. May He bring you home rejoicing at the wonders He has shown you. May He bring you home rejoicing, once again, into our doors.